Richard.
Good morning, good morning. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you too, Richard. How are you doing?
I'm very well, very well, very well indeed.
Good, good. Yeah. So today we're talking about stories, and I know that stories are something that I'm assuming that you use in your work and creativity.
Totally. In my professional work, in my creative thinking, and just being aware of the narratives, and in my life as well. But absolutely, yes. So.
And I suppose like there are different reasons that we use stories, like because I know that you do a lot of work with branding, and
Yeah.
branding is a story in itself, isn't it? You know, like
Totally. Oh, totally. Just yesterday, I was helping somebody with a pitch document, and they were trying to get across facts, and I was explaining that actually we need a narrative. And when it comes to an organization, they also have a narrative. And I'm doing a lot of research around the idea of archetypes and archetypal storytelling, and the contrast of stories that goes on within brands, and the stories that they tell and the way that works. So, and how they tell stories.
Yes, because if the brand doesn't really tell a story well enough, it's not going to make very much of an impact. You know, I think I've heard you say before that you try and appeal to the emotions as well with the brand, right?
Absolutely. Fundamentally, a brand is there trying to help a consumer or a person make a decision. And that person needs a narrative. And we all have our own narratives, and they're fundamental to the way that we decide, the choices we make, where we see ourselves, how we see ourselves. So a brand's narrative actually becomes a person's narrative when they link with it, when they connect it, it informs their behaviors. And so that's how a brand's narrative works. It helps to define someone else's narrative, and they connect to it and they see themselves through that narrative.
That's right. That's the key word, the connection. Because let's say, for example, Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is a very strong brand. And I used to drink a lot of Coca-Cola in the past. But then when the story around that became, oh, well, it's not good for you.
Yes.
Then I don't drink it very much. I don't often buy Coca-Cola now, because the story of Coca-Cola remains the same, but my story has changed. And so the connection I make with that is not the same. It's not going to persuade me to buy it anymore.
Yes. Yeah. And other things are going on in this world all the time, aren't they? You know, right now, the narrative that we're all part of is global warming, the global impact that's going on in this world. And brands are having to work out their narrative. What's their story within that? What side do they go for? How strong do they tell their story within that world? And then people like you are then going, well, what's my narrative in here, and how do I connect that? And does this brand reinforce that narrative? So totally. And what's fascinating for me, I'm doing research at the moment on narrative and on archetypes in branding. And what's really interesting for me is how the brands are trying to tell multiple stories, not just a single story now. It's not, this is how a narrative, here it is, and how those narratives can be contradictory. So how can a brand like Pepsi be all about love and just pleasure and delight and connection and indulgence, and at the same time then have a narrative which is about, you know, they also want to create a narrative where they're talking about their role in this global climate and their role in terms of saving the planet. So it's like, okay, how can you have these contradictory roles? And that's what a brand has to try and work out, how to weave those with different personalities, different archetypes, telling those stories.
That's right. It's like appealing to the values of different people. So, for example, as I said earlier, I may not buy Pepsi because I don't think sugar is good for me. But if I feel persuaded by, look how much good they're doing for nature, because that value appeals to my own, then I might buy Pepsi for my friends. I might not buy it for myself. I might buy it for my friends and think, well, they like it, so, and they can, sugar isn't that bad for them. It's bad for me because I'm diabetic, but it's not bad for them. So I might still end up buying that product because they have, as you say, they've implemented different values into it.
Yes, and it's really interesting just hearing the complexity of narrative in your own mind there, because not only are you working out your own story, but you're working out your friends' narratives, and therefore your interconnection with your friends and what role you play in that friendship, and therefore what role these brands can play and the products that they provide in that narrative and working in that way. It's one of the interesting things that I'm looking into is this whole idea of contrast and tension between narratives. And in a way, that's what makes us interesting in ourselves, this tension between doing right and doing wrong, or what is right and what is wrong. And we have this really powerful ability to focus in on things that we believe is true, or we believe are true. So in a story, what the story goes to reinforce what we believe to be true. So we believe that sugar is bad for us. We believe that companies that produce a lot of sugar are bad. So we have these narratives, but how much we then pick on that and choose to pull that in is our choice. And that's what's really interesting in terms of shaping our narrative. And because you then have the contrast of, but I like that. Oh, we'll only have that every now and then. Oh, it's a treat. So what's interesting is that tension between, we all know what's good for us. We all know that we shouldn't get into a car ever again because it's going to drive global warming, but we want to go somewhere. We want to do things. And these tensions and how we navigate these tensions become our narrative. And that's what's really interesting. And that's how brands play a role in helping someone navigate the tensions in their own internal narratives.
That's right. And I suppose like airplanes, even though we know that airplanes are having an adverse impact, we still want to travel. We still want to see our families who live in different countries.
We still want to go on holidays.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so narratives, we are nothing without our narrative. It's really interesting that if you actually took our narratives away, what would we become? We're nothing. That's our DNA in terms of our self-image. That's the framework and that we use all the time to reference our decisions, our choices. So in the world of brands and in the world of creativity even, so you've got the brands trying to tell our stories and trying to influence their role within our narrative and change our narratives in the way we consume. But as a creative, we're also having to redefine our own stories so that we explore new avenues and don't get caught in the sort of continuous loop of a narrative that has been built up. And the classic narrative, I'm not good enough. I'm not able to come up with these ideas, and that willingness to then go, but actually have a narrative that says out of chaos comes amazing solutions, and the belief that rebirth of an idea is possible through disconnect to any truth is really interesting. So there's these things where we can use narratives, we can be held hostage by a narrative, but we can use narratives to free ourselves as well. And that's really interesting.
And I suppose one of the biggest choices, because you talk about choice a lot, and one of the biggest or the most important choice that we have to make is what role are we going to play in this story? What totally. Is the role? Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I watched a movie last night, and somebody, it was Harry Potter, and there's a scene in Harry Potter, the movie, where he's been finding himself being weighed down by the thought that he's becoming evil, he's being overtaken by this evil archetype within him. And he was talking to someone, and they said, we're all good and bad. It's the choices that we make defines us. So they're sat there, all these archetypes, all these narratives are sat there. And if we let them, they rule our lives. But what makes it interesting is when we then choose which narratives we wish to play and be the editor, the art director of our own narrative. And that's a fascinating psychology and role in our lives.
Yes. So are we allowing the role to define us, or are we being conscious that we are, it's a, we could change the role, that we
do. Totally. But change gives us anxiety. It was said once that any form of change, whether that's, from moving house to choosing a new computer, is stressful. And so there is real comfort, and brands know this because they know we won't change bank accounts and all those things. But there is a real comfort in just sticking to our narrative, just sitting back in the armchair of life and just go, this is who I am, this is what I believe, this is right, this is wrong, I'm just going to flow this. The interesting route is to try and question our narrative, but it's hugely disconcerting. It's hugely unsettling to change our narrative and redefine that for anybody.
And I suppose,
who am I? That fundamental question, who am I? And then when you reevaluate what that is, that becomes really interesting.
That's right. And so, with these archetypes, who am I?
Yeah.
That will, the choice of the archetypes that we express. And I think like we all have all of the archetypes in our unconscious, don't we? That,
yes.
We have both the villain and the hero, that, we can choose to play a villain in, maybe like on purpose. We want to play the villain.
Yeah, it feels good. It feels good to be the villain. There's a gentleman called Dr. Richard Swartz who developed a thing called internal family systems, IFS. And he believed that, or recognized that actually within us are multiple archetypes. And that was a good thing because we learn so much, but it's being aware of these archetypes, which is fundamental to our own personal development, to recognize that we have these villains and heroes in us. Because if we just think of ourselves as perfect, as good, as one-dimensional, and there is as a core human need, we have a need for certainty. And so sometimes we just go, oh, I am this. This is who I am. I can't change. And this is who my archetype is. I am this. I'm Scorpio. I'm a good person, or I'm an angry person, or I'm a whatever person. But what is really powerful is actually looking inside and hearing the voices of these different archetypes talk to each other, have the conversations, and recognize that exists within us all, and just break the general noise, the interference noise, and isolate them into different characters, and then recognize the roles that they play in influencing our lives. And then being able to have conversations as to what drives that character to then influence it in a way. And that's very enlightening.
Yeah, you mentioned what did you mention? But you said something just now, and it reminded me. Yeah, you said I'm Scorpio, for example, or and I think we can start to identify with our horoscopes. We can identify with being, or I'm an extrovert, or I'm an introvert, or I've done the Enneagram and I'm this, or I've done the
Myers-Briggs. I'm this. This is who I am, and you exaggerate and you become that. It's really interesting for me to use narratives, because if we say, right, I'm going to run a marathon, and then you start to share that narrative, it becomes you. It's like, oh, I'm going to do this now. Oh, I've stopped drinking coffee. I'm becoming healthy. I'm going to drink smoothies and all that, and it becomes this role. And we can use narratives to drive ourselves forward as long as we don't become slaved by them. And then that's the interesting, that when there's a lovely idea that we are the stories we tell, minus the stories no one wants to listen to anymore. And so when we go to parties, they'll say, oh, hello, this is Richard or Sue or Ian, and it's like, oh, what do I say? How do I talk about myself? What stories do I share? And the stories that we choose to share often then go on and define us, then people will have more conversations about those subjects, and you find yourself orbiting around certain narratives. And therefore, it's interesting sometimes, even just in conversations, to throw in an aspect that you just didn't know. And from a creative point of view, you might just say, oh, I'll just throw in something that is different. So I'm a poet. Now, I'm not an officially a poet, but why am I not a poet? But I use language, I use rhythm in language, I use rhythm in creativity. So why could I not call myself a poet? And I know a lot of my creative people will often change their profile identities on LinkedIn and how they describe themselves as I'm a creative thinker, or in fact, I'm just a warrior. And it's like, what does that mean? Well, it just means and it's part of it. So labels and narratives are really important.
And I suppose that our story changes based on who it is that we're with. You talk about being at a party, for example, and having a conversation with somebody, and the stories that we tell need to be the ones that they're associated with, that are relevant to them.
Because we like people to like our stories. We inherently, so we're looking for stories that will connect with them. And it's really interesting, this choice of selection of what story do I tell? In this interview now, which are the stories that I tell you within these few minutes that we're having a conversation? How do I choose those stories to infer those? I was asked by some academics for interview techniques when they're interviewing, and how can they come across better at interviews? And one of the classic questions that an academic will be asked is, what research do you like, or do you feel has been the most fundamental? And they can tell a story about their own choice, but often in interviews you have to work out what is the interviewer looking for and choose the research that describes what characters you want to portray. So we are all the time selecting, what stories do we say about ourselves? What does somebody like? What have they liked? When did they smile? Did they laugh at that? Did they not laugh at that? Oh, I'm not going to share that story again. And then all of a sudden that aspect of you potentially goes. And we get those even in parenting. What stories do we allow our children to play? We often say, oh, don't tell stories, but stories and imagination are really important in a child's development. And we often just go, oh, we stop those things, whereas actually we should be encouraging them.
Yeah, encouraging children to create their own stories and
totally, and play with them and explore them as a concept for self-development, rather than something that is often labeled as storytelling is making things up that aren't real. Well, what is real? It's such an interesting concept in itself. Real is the reality that we choose to put on the world. And actually that's real for us, but it could be totally different for somebody else. So narratives are a way of exploring the world and defining ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And so much, like over the last 100 years since Carl Jung started writing about the collective unconscious and the archetypes, that's probably a little bit more just over 100 years ago. We've read and written a lot about the role of the unconscious and the unconscious. And what is it that you think that we still need to be exploring? I know you talked about the research that you're doing now. What is it that you think would make a big difference if we knew more about that?
I'm really glad you asked that, because I think the big mystery for me about narrative and storytelling and archetypes is the multiple archetypes working inside, whether that's for a brand or ourselves. And we haven't really understood enough the complexity and the interaction and the role of these different archetypes. So the model that I'm working with has 60 archetypes, the way it maps a brand. Conventional models maybe use something like 12. But even those 60 in themselves are not just, a brand isn't just one of these archetypes. What they are is blends of multiple archetypes working together to tell stories at different levels. And I think that's the next stage. We went through the Myers-Briggs, recognizing and trying to find, oh, which one are you? Are you this one, what combination? And then we start to recognize with the Myers-Briggs that they talk about, well, when you're talking to somebody, you bring more of this quality in. So there's a primary, a secondary, and a tertiary archetype. But what we haven't really moved on is the fact that we've constantly blending archetypes and narratives and stories all the time. And it's not as simple as a primary one or a tertiary one. And we just switch between that when we're talking to different people. There's constant blends of archetypes going on. And it's actually that tension that forces us to learn and grow. Because if we were dominated by one archetype, then we would just be limited. Whereas our creativity, our imagination, is that tension, is that muse-like quality that archetypes provide us to grow and develop. Mm-hmm. So that's the big thing for me. I think that's the stage of evolution that we're now at. A new paradigm is moving away from recognizing, first of all, that it used to be thought that emotions possessed us. In Roman times, they were thought to have been demons. Our emotions were thought to be something that occupied us and should be banished. Right now, there is a concept around multiple disorder as a negative, that we shouldn't have these multiple personalities. But I believe we're going through a process where people recognize that actually and embrace our multiple archetypes and use that as a way to really develop as human beings. So that's my thoughts.
Yeah, that's very interesting, isn't it? You know, because we've always thought people with multiple personalities, we've always thought up to now, we've thought of it as being
a bad thing. Yeah, it's like embarrassing. It's like, oh, and we're all on a spectrum of some sort, you know, and we the narrative is, oh, multiple disorder, oh, stay away from that. I've got one personality, I'm consistent, I'm strong. No, you know, you, me, everybody watching this recognizes in themselves the tension that's going on. But actually, how much time do we spend really listening to those different archetypes and understanding and recognizing? It's a little bit like an orchestra, tuning your ear to hear the instruments that are playing and actually what's going on and what's out of tune. And that. So that for me is the mystery of the narrative that's about to unfold, the new paradigm in branding, but also sort of psychology and understanding of self and personal development.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. And I suppose that it's also to do with, like, you know, you have these 60 archetypes, and those 60 archetypes, of course, it's more nuanced than having only 12 archetypes.
Yes.
But at the same time, you know, 60 times 60, you know, it's like it can be increasingly more and more complex. And
exactly, and that's the truth. If you look at brands, you know, you can't just say every brand in the world falls into one of 12 archetypes or even one of 60 archetypes. You know, and it is these subtle interactions, these percentages, these waves of emphasis and then submission of archetypes and flows that actually makes a brand interesting, as in a movie. If you think about any movie and you know, the classic hero's journey where somebody evolves through the tension within, that's actually what makes a movie interesting, and it therefore what makes a brand interesting, and really it's what makes us interesting. What, you know, if we were having coffee, if I was just telling you the world was perfect and everything I did was wonderful, it's like, okay, all of a sudden after 5 minutes I'm bored. It's only when you realize that I'm suffering with pressure of trying to get this and balance this, and how can I be a good father at the same time as be a creative genius or whatever. And it's like all of these interplays are balances, and that's what makes someone interesting, and that's what makes someone authentic and human after all.
Yes, that's right. As in opposition to the facade, we can all create this facade of perfection.
Yeah. It's lovely, and movies play on that. They play on the idea that they first present a character who wants to present their face, how they want to be perceived to others. But then they unpick that and recognize the tensions and the archetypes at play within that person. You know, the classic Batman, where he was good and he's evil. And it's like, that's what makes him interesting. And we're seeing really interesting movies come out now on that are challenging the role of heroes in the classic way, and that they can be villains at the same time. There's many new series that are coming out on all the TV channels. And so it's interesting how movie storytelling are reflecting society. Whereas if you go back 20, 40, 60 years, it was always, you know, the princess was beautiful and good, and the villain was always ugly and bad, you know, and it was always easy to tell what those were. Now there's complexity and intrigue. And that's exactly what we're finding in brands, that it isn't these binary, oh, you're blue and you're good and you believe in this. It's no, we're trying to get this and we're trying to address that. And this is when brands become interesting. So that's what I find. And equally with creativity itself, you know, it really frees us up to recognize our different archetypes at play and how we can bring them in, you know, way beyond De Bono's thinking hats, that idea that we put on one type of hat, but actually we have an interplay of characters that can talk to each other. That for me is interesting.
And that's what makes even this conversation that we're having, it's like we're having a conversation about stories and creativity, but at the same time, it's like, I don't know what you're going to say next, and you don't know what I'm going to say next. And so there is that unknown, and in that unknown, something creative happens because it hasn't been pre-structured, I suppose, you know.
And it's the whole improvisation and the role of improvisation within creativity and story playing and role, and accessing, as you were just alluding to earlier, which was the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. And the fact that narratives, one of the key things that I've learned and discovered over my time is that emotions are the language of the subconscious. And if you think of, therefore, accessing our imagination as accessing our emotions, and therefore emotions drawing out, those emotions build narratives. And those emotions pull things together. They draw like-minded concepts together. So emotions are like this glue or magnet that attracts stuff. So what I am doing is drawing on your emotion, your feelings, that then draws my ideas. And that's how the interplay of a narrative builds. And so if your mood felt changed, if all of a sudden I felt a sadness in your voice, that then at a subconscious level is bringing in new content that is drawn by that. If I feel your sadness, I will then pull up stories from that equal my sadness. And so this interplay between archetypes, emotions, thoughts, and then behaviors is fundamental to human development, branding, creativity, everything like that. So I was really pleased when you chose stories.
Yes. And also the fact that, you know, we're so different. We have very different life experiences. And I suppose the more the distance between my story and your story, that bridging the gap between those different stories creates a much bigger story than if I'm just talking with someone who has very similar experiences to myself. You know, the distance traveled there might not broaden out my story, but you know, it's that longer bridge, isn't it?
Yes.
And creating those longer bridges, we enrich our own story and make it.
We hear our stories through different lenses. So as I said before, when you listen to an orchestra, it's hard to pick out different instruments and you have to tune your ears. When we talk to other people, like I talk to you now, and I hear archetypes in you that maybe are different and more dominant than in mine, you know, maybe more caring or more understanding or more listening. But it then makes me hear those in myself as well. So by listening to your story, I'm also hearing in more detail aspects of me that I didn't recognize I had. So you become a mirror to myself, and then I learn through you and that way. And so we bounce off, and that's what a good conversation is. it's going, okay, well, how are you feeling? What's your feeling? What do you feel about this? And then thoughts come through, and then I can bring my thoughts associated with that feeling. And it's like, oh, my thoughts are different. The feeling's the same, but my thoughts are different. Why is that? What interaction's going on? And that's what makes conversation interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when you talk about the branding and about having the embracing the complexities within the brand, because otherwise a brand may appeal to a narrow range of people, but not a diverse range. Like, for example, a hero. Who is a hero? A hero to you may not be a hero to me, because I can't see myself reflected in that person.
Exactly. And not only that, even if a brand was to try and become the hero, so let's say I'm looking at the AA, the Automobile Association, and that whole rescuer, are broken down. But actually, there's a whole more load of messaging that they want to communicate, that they're modern, that they're innovating new ideas. So if I'm somebody that likes something new, then I'll pick on that part of the story. Whereas if I want the trusted, established, been around history for so many years sort of company, I'll pick on that aspect. And it's like, what ignites in me? And so by telling a broader story, you're enabling people with their different stories to connect and see what they want to see.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Richard. I've really enjoyed that conversation. Great. And I look forward to hearing more about the research that you're doing. That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, no, it is. Yes. Well, I think so anyway. Bless you. Take care now.
See you soon. Bye for now. Bye-bye.
Bye.